The auctioneer had already given up on the ox before the gate even opened. He stood at the rail with his little book against his belly and read the lot number in a flat voice. As a man reads a name, he does not expect anyone to answer. Lot 41. Steer, working ox, broke to yoke, unsound. He said that last word, unsound, and let it sit there in the cold barn air like a stone dropped down a well. Nobody moved. The heater lamps buzzed over the sail ring and threw a hard orange light down onto the sawdust. And into that light the handler walked the animal that nobody had come to buy. Elias Trueblood watched from the top rail with his coffee going cold in his glove and his breath hanging in front of his face. And he felt something in his chest go quiet and stubborn at the same time. The ox came in sway-backed and slow, a big red-roan beast with a dip in his spine like a sag in an old porch and a left horn that had grown down and inward, curling toward his own jaw instead of out toward the sky the way a horn is meant to. One eye had a white haze across the bottom of it. He limped just slightly on the near hind, and he did not toss his head or roll his eyes or paw at the sawdust the way a green animal does. He only stood there under the lamps and looked out at the empty seats with the patience of something that had been looked at before and found wanting. A man 2 spots down whistled low through his teeth. "That's not an ox," he said. "That's a lawn ornament." The men around him laughed the short laugh that men laugh when the joke is cheap and the day is long, and the auctioneer waited for it to die and then started the bidding at $50 and got nothing, and dropped it to $40 and got nothing, and dropped it to $25, and the barn stayed as silent as a church between hymns. Elias knew what came next. He had been to enough sales. An animal nobody bids on does not go home. It goes down the road to the killer buyer at the end of the aisle, the heavy man in the canvas coat who bought the culls by the pound for dog food and rendering and did not care whether a horn curled in or out. The man had already stood up, already reached for his own little book, already turned his shoulder toward the ring as an undertaker turns toward a bed. And Elias, who had come to the sale for a hydraulic post driver and 2 rolls of woven wire, and absolutely not for a broken ox, heard his own voice come up out of him before he had decided a single thing. $25, he said. The auctioneer's head came up. He had the look of a man who has found a coin in a coat he was about to give away. $25 I have. $25 once. He rattled off the numbers fast now, trying to catch a second bidder before the moment cooled, but there was no second bidder. There was only the killer buyer easing back down onto the bench with a small, private shrug, and the men laughing again, softer. At the fool up on the top rail who had just paid folding money for a thing you could get for free if you were willing to haul it. "Sold," the auctioneer said. $25. And to the young fella up top, God bless him. The barn laughed a third time, and Elias climbed down and paid his $25 in $5 bills to a girl at a card table and signed a paper and did not once look at the men who were watching him, because he had learned a long time ago that a man who explains himself at a livestock sale has already lost. He was 38 years old that winter, a wide-shouldered, slow-moving man with a red beard going gray at the corners of his mouth and hands that had been broken and reset so many times they no longer closed all the way. He farmed 160 acres in a cold valley where the road ran out, 40 of it in hay and the rest in a rough pasture that climbed up toward a spruce ridge. And he ran a small herd of black cattle that he calved out in the worst month of the year because that was when the calves would be big enough to sell in the fall. He was not a rich man. He was the kind of poor that owns things outright and still cannot sleep in February. His wife, Marta, kept the books and the garden and a flock of brown hens and a temper that came out sideways and quiet. And their girl, who was small and serious and named after Marta's mother, followed the both of them around the place with a bucket that was always too big for her. They had a good tractor, a green diesel with 40 years on it and a loader on the front, and they had a wood stove that ate a cord a week when the cold came down hard off the ridge, and they had a well with an electric pump 300 feet down, and every one of those good things ran on something that came from somewhere else. That was the part Elias did not think about, driving home that afternoon with the ox standing in the stock trailer behind him, swaying with the ruts in the road, looking out through the slats at a country he had never seen. Marta met the truck in the yard with her arms crossed and the wind pulling at her hair. She looked at the trailer, and then she looked at what was in it. And then she looked at her husband for a long moment without saying anything at all, which was worse than saying something. "What," she said finally, "in the name of everything, is that?" "That's an ox," Elias said. He came around the back of the trailer and dropped the gate, and the ox backed out slow and careful, one foot and in another, testing the ground, and stood in the yard with the low sun coming red through the spruce and his crooked horn throwing a shadow across his own face. "He is sway-backed," Marta said. "He is half-blind. He is lame. And you paid money for him." $25, Elias said. $25 we do not have, she said, for a thing that will eat hay all winter and give us nothing back but manure. The little girl had come out onto the porch in her nightgown and her father's wool socks, and she was staring at the ox, with her whole face open, the open-mouthed stare of a child in front of something enormous and gentle, and the ox turned his good eye toward her and stood very still, and something in the way he did it made Marta stop talking. She pressed her lips together. She was not a woman who lost an argument and admitted it, and she was not going to start now, but she looked at the animal standing quiet in her yard with the child on the porch, and she uncrossed her arms. "He can't stay in the good barn," she said. "He goes in the lean-to." Elias said all right. He was worth more than that, the girl said suddenly from the porch in her small, clear voice. And both of her parents turned to look at her. Nobody wanted him, so they were going to grind him up. That's not the same as him not being worth anything. Marta opened her mouth and shut it. Elias, who did not say much and said less when he was moved, walked over to his daughter and picked her up off the porch and carried her inside out of the cold. And behind them the ox lowered his big head to the frozen grass of the yard and began, patiently, to eat. The ox learned the place faster than a man would have believed. Elias named him Ledger, because Marta kept saying the animal was a debit and never a credit, and Elias thought a name like that might turn her, and it did not, but it stuck. By the second week, Ledger knew the sound of the feed bucket and the shape of the gate and the exact place along the fence where the child liked to stand and talk to him about nothing at all. He learned the words a working ox learns, the gee and the haw and the whoa and the low steady get up, and Elias found that under the swayed back and the clouded eye there was a broke ox of the old kind. An animal that had been yoked and driven by somebody long ago and had not forgotten bit of it. Some old man had made this animal patient season on patient season, and then that old man had died or gone broke or gone to a home, and the animal he made had gone down the road to a sale where the only bid was the killer's bid. Elias thought about that more than he meant to. He built a bow yoke that winter out of a curved length of white oak he had been saving for a wagon tongue, steamed it and bent it and pegged it, and he fitted it to Ledger's neck by feel, as his own grandfather had shown him 40 years back, and the ox stood for the fitting without a flinch, turning his good eye back now and then as if to check that the man behind him knew what he was about. The neighbors thought it was a joke. A man named Cyrus Halloran farmed the big flat ground down the valley, 800 acres of it, and he ran new equipment and a wide green four-wheel drive tractor with a heated cab and a radio. And he had a way of leaning on a fence and saying a cruel thing so gently it took you a minute to feel the cut. He drove past Elias's place one gray afternoon when Elias was out in the field driving stakes with the ox skidding a stone boat behind him, and he slowed his truck and put down the window and looked out at the sway-backed animal and the homemade yoke, and he smiled. "Elias," he called. "I didn't know they still made those. You want I should bring you a plow horse from the museum, too." And Elias, who had known Cyrus his whole life and did not hate him, only found him tiring, lifted one hand off the ox's flank and said, "He does what I ask. That's more than I can say for most things I've paid for." Cyrus laughed and drove on, and the story went around the valley by the next Sunday, the way stories do out where there's nothing to do but watch each other. And men repeated it in the feed store and at the diner counter, the thing about Elias Trueblood and his $25 ox, and how a man with a good diesel tractor sitting in his shed had gone and put a broke-down bull in a wooden yoke like it was 1880 and not now. Elias walked into the feed store on a Saturday to buy mineral and a sack of milk replacer. And the talk stopped short the way it always stops when the man it is about comes through the door. And then a fellow named Turlington, who ran the counter, grinned and asked, loud enough for the three men by the stove to hear, whether Elias wanted his order loaded into the truck or hitched to the ox. The men by the stove laughed. Elias paid for his mineral and carried it out himself and said nothing, and that was worse for them than if he had cursed, because a man who will not be shamed cannot be made small. And they knew it, and they went back to the stove a little quieter than they had been. Word of that went around, too. But the thing the valley told and retold left out the part that mattered, because the valley had not been there in the gray afternoons when Elias worked the ox in the near field and learned what he had bought. An ox is not a horse. A horse gives you speed and nerve and a great deal of trouble. An ox gives you weight and patience and a mind that, once it has learned a thing, holds it like Scripture. Elias would set a straight furrow with a marker and say gee, and the ox would step to the right, off, and haw, and the ox would step to the left, near. And Elias found he did not need to touch him at all, that the voice was the whole bridle, that a word dropped low and even would turn 2,000 pounds as neat as a rudder turns a boat. He taught him to stand ground tied while a chain was hooked, to back a sledge into a shed door with 3 inches to spare on either side, to lean into a stuck load and hold the pull without lunging until the thing broke free. He learned the ox's one bad habit, a tendency to swing his crooked horn toward a gatepost as if he had a grudge against it. And he learned to say the animal's name in a certain tone a half-second before the horn came around, and the ox would check himself and blow through his nose and walk on straight. It was the oldest kind of work there is, older than the wheel, a man, and an ox, and a length of oak between them, and Elias found in it a quiet he had not had since he was a boy. Back before the whole business of farming had become a business of debt on things that ran on fuel and failed in the cold. Marta heard it at the church potluck and came home with her jaw set. "They are laughing at you," she said. "They are laughing at us." And Elias said he knew, and he ate his supper, and he did not stop working the ox. What Marta did not fully see, because she was inside with the books and the child and the hens and the thousand small worries that keep a farm wife from ever sitting all the way down, was that the ox had begun to be useful in a way that had nothing to do with proving a point. The green tractor was old. Its glow plugs were tired and its batteries were tired. And on the mornings when the mercury slid down below zero, it would not start without a fight, and sometimes it would not start at all. And Elias would stand in the cold shed with the ether can in his hand, knowing that ether was hard on an old engine, and using it anyway because the cattle had to be fed. On those mornings, more and more, he found he simply did not bother with the tractor. He yoked the ox instead. Ledger did not have glow plugs. Ledger did not have a battery that died at 15 below. Ledger woke in his lean-to on the coldest morning of the year with frost on his lashes and stood up out of his own body heat and walked out into the dark to be yoked, and when Elias said, "Get up," the ox leaned into the yoke, and the sledge of hay bales came sliding across the snow behind him as steady as a clock. A grown ox in good work will pull his own body weight all day and twice his weight in a pinch, and Ledger weighed near 2,000 pounds, and he was, in the plain arithmetic of it, a diesel engine that ran on hay and needed no starting. Elias began to keep more hay in the loft over the lean to just so it would be close to the animal that could move it. He did not tell Marta this was a plan. He was not sure it was a plan. It felt more like a thing his hands had decided without asking the rest of him. In December, the vet came out to preg-check the heifers, a young woman named Odalise who had taken over the practice from the old doctor and knew more than the old doctor ever had, and she stood in the alley in her coveralls with her arm in a long glove and read off the due dates. And then she leaned on the gate and looked over at Ledger in the far pen and asked what the story was there. Elias told her. She looked at the crooked horn and the swayed back and the clouded eye for a while. "That's a working ox," she said at last. "You don't see them any more. My granddad drove one in Portugal when he was a boy." Then she looked at Elias the way a person looks at another person they have decided to trust. "Your first calf heifer, the black one with a star," she said. "She's carrying a big calf and she's carrying it out back. If we get a real storm during your calving and you lose the tractor, that heifer is going to be a long way from the barn in the worst of it. You want to think about that now, before it's a 2 a.m. problem." Elias said he'd think about it. He did think about it. He thought about it every day for the rest of that month, and he moved the calving pen closer to the barn as far as the water and the wind would let him, and he split and stacked another 4 cords of wood along the north wall until the woodpile stood taller than his daughter's head, and he filled every trough and barrel he owned, and something in him, some animal part older than his reasons, kept the ox fed and rested and ready. And out on the flat ground down the valley, Cyrus Halloran, who had a generator he had never tested and a tractor he trusted completely, and no ox at all, did none of these things. The storm came in on the 3rd week of January, and it did not come the way a snowstorm comes. It came as rain. The radio out of the county seat had been saying freezing rain for 2 days, and everyone had heard freezing rain before and thought they knew what it meant. A slick road and a broken branch and a day of stepping careful, and nobody in the valley was ready for what actually fell out of that low green sky. It began just after dark, a soft rain that ticked against the windows. And the ground was so cold from a month of hard weather that every drop froze the instant it touched. It froze on the grass, and it froze on the wire, and it froze on the trees, and it kept raining, and it kept freezing, layer on layer, all night long. Elias woke at some black hour to a sound he had never heard, a vast, slow cracking and groaning that came from everywhere at once, and he lay in the dark and listened to the forest breaking. The spruce on the ridge could not carry the weight. A spruce holds its branches out flat and stiff, and the ice built up on them a quarter inch, and then a half inch, and then an inch thick, until a single bow carried 100 pounds of glass, and then the wood let go. He heard the trees going down all across the valley, the long tearing rip and the crash, one after another, like a battle being fought in the dark by an enemy he could not see. And then, near 4 in the morning, the power went out. It did not flicker. It went, and stayed gone, and the little red light on the smoke detector died. And the hum that a house makes that you never hear until it stops, stopped. The furnace fan quit. The well pump 300 feet down quit. The yard light on the pole went black, and the dark came all the way up to the windows. Elias got up in the cold and lit the lamp and went to the window and looked out at a world that had turned to glass. In the last of the moonlight before the clouds closed it off, every surface he could see was sheathed in ice, the fence and the gate and the bare apple tree and the roof of the barn, all of it gleaming, all of it groaning, and the power line that ran down the lane from the road hung in a great glittering swag between two poles, and as he watched, one of the poles simply leaned over sideways under the ice and lay down in the field, and the wire came down with it, and the last light in the valley was the sparks it threw before it died. He stood there a moment. Then he went and woke Marta and told her the power was out and likely to stay out, and to keep the child in bed under every quilt they owned, and to open the wood stove damper and keep it fed, and he began to pull on his clothes in the dark. She caught his arm. "The tractor won't start in this," she said. "It's colder than it's ever been, and the batteries are half dead, and you know it won't start. And the cattle are out back. And that heifer. He said he knew. He said he was not going to try the tractor." She looked at him in the lamplight and understood, and for the first time in 2 months she did not say a word against the ox. He went out into the cold, and it took the breath out of him. The rain had stopped and left the world locked in a shell of ice, and the cold behind it was a cold with teeth, a still, heavy, killing cold, and everything was slick as a river in spring. He could not stand up on it. He had to go on his hands and feet across the yard like an animal, breaking through the crust where he could, and it took him 10 minutes to cross a space he could walk in 20 seconds on a summer day. The tractor shed door was frozen shut, and he had to chip it free with a hatchet. He did not even try the tractor. He went past it in the dark to the lean-to, and he heard the ox before he saw him, the big, slow breathing and the shift of a great body in the straw, and he opened the door, and there was Ledger, standing whole, warm, a wall of living heat in the frozen dark, with frost on his lashes and his crooked horn and his patient, clouded eye turning back to find the man. Elias put his hand flat on the animal's neck and felt the heat come up into his cold fingers and stood there 1 second longer than he needed to. "All right," he said. "All right. Let's go to work." He yoked the ox by feel in the pitch dark, the way he had practiced without knowing he was practicing, and he let him out onto the ice, and the ox walked out onto that glass on his cloven feet. And where a horse would have gone down, and a man went on all fours, the ox split hooves, found the crust, and held. A steer's foot has 2 toes that spread under his weight, and the sharp edges of them bit down through the glaze to the frozen grass beneath, and the animal that was too sway-backed and too lame and too blind to bring a bid at the sale walked across the killing ice as sure and slow as a boat. And behind him he pulled a man who had nothing left in the whole modern world that would run. The work began before dawn and did not stop. First, the water. 30 head of cattle in the cold will drink a great deal, and every trough on the place had frozen to a solid block once the electric heaters died, and the well would not lift a drop without the pump. But the creek at the bottom of the pasture still ran under its lid of ice, and Elias had a 100-gallon poly tank on a low sledge. And he hitched the ox to the sledge and drove him down to the creek and chopped a hole through the ice with the hatchet and filled the tank a bucket at a time by lantern light. And then said, "Get up," and the ox leaned into the yoke and dragged 1,000 pounds of water back up the frozen slope to the cattle, and Elias broke the ice on the troughs and poured it in. And the cattle came crowding and drank. He made that trip 4 times before the light came gray in the east, 400 gallons up a hill no truck could have climbed and no man could have carried. And the animal did it without complaint, breathing great plumes of steam into the dark, his cloven feet holding where nothing else would hold. Then the feed. The round bales were stacked at the top of the lane a quarter-mile off, near 600 pounds each and glazed over with a skin of ice, and there was no getting the tractor to them and no getting them to the cattle except behind the ox. A round bale is a thing built to be moved by a tractor loader and by nothing else, too heavy to lift, too big to roll far by hand, and there were 14 of them left in the stack, and 30 head of cattle, burning through their own fat to stay warm in a cold like this, would want the better part of a whole bale a day just to hold their heat. Elias rolled a bale onto the stone boat with a pry bar, grunting it up over the lip an inch at a time, and the ox took the weight and skidded it down the glazed lane to the pasture, 600 pounds, sliding smooth on the frozen ground behind 2,000 pounds of patient muscle. And Elias cut the twine, and the cattle buried their faces in it, and steam rose off their backs. And he went back up the lane for another. 1,200 pounds of hay a day the ox brought down that lane, every day, a load in the gray morning and a load in the blue dusk. And never once did the animal balk at the climb back up empty or lean short on the pull coming down loaded. By full light, Marta had come out to help, moving on all fours across the yard the way he had. Her face white with the cold and something else, and she stood at the fence and watched her husband and the ox come up the lane with the second bale, the sway-backed animal walking into the harness with his head low and his breath pouring out, and the ice cracking off the oak yoke, and she did not say anything, but she put her hand up to her mouth. Then the wood. The stove had been eating hard all night to hold the house at 50 degrees, and the split wood on the porch was nearly gone, and the pile along the north wall stood 40 feet off across a sheet of ice a man could not walk on carrying an armload. So the ox brought the wood too, load after load on the stone boat, and the child watched from the window wrapped in a quilt and counted the loads out loud to her mother. And the house grew warm, and the kettle went back on the stove that did not need power, and there was coffee. And then, near 10 in the morning, with the sky the color of a dead fire and the whole valley silent and glittering and broken, the heifer began to calve. And she began to calve in the worst possible place, out at the far corner of the back pasture, 300 yards from the barn, down in the low ground, where the wind had scoured the ice to a mirror. Elias saw her from the lane, saw her go down on her side away from the herd, and he knew before he got close that it was wrong. The black heifer with the star was carrying too big a calf, Adalis had said so, and now the water bag showed, and one small hoof showed, and it was pointing the wrong way, sole up, and there was a second hoof that would not come, and the heifer strained and got nowhere, and her sides heaved, and out here in this cold, a calf born slow would be a calf born dead, chilled through before it drew a breath. There was no way to get her to the barn. She could not stand, and a man could not carry her, and there was no machine on the place that would run. Elias knelt on the ice beside her and got his hand in and felt the trouble, a leg turned back, the head coming without both feet, a calf hung up on its own shoulder in a first calf heifer too narrow to give. He had pulled calves before. He had a set of chains and a handle in his coat. He always did in January. But you cannot pull a calf that is bent back on itself. You have to set the leg first, push the calf back in against the heifer's straining, and bring the leg around. And he had done it before, and he had lost some before, and he knew the one thing he did not have out here on the ice was time or leverage or a warm, dry place to lay a wet calf down before it froze. And he knelt there in the wind with his arm inside the animal and made the decision that the whole winter had been walking him toward without his knowing it. He looked up at the ox standing patient in the yoke with the sledge behind him, and he understood what the sledge was for. He worked fast. He got the leg first, pushing the calf back against every heave of the heifer, his arm burning with the cold and the strain, until his fingers found the bent hock and cupped the little hoof in his palm so it would not tear the mother coming around. And he brought it up and forward and got both feet pointing the way God meant them to. And then he ran the chains, a loop above each fetlock, and clipped the handle across, and this was the part where a lesser winter ended with a dead calf. Because a man alone cannot always pull hard enough and steady enough and long enough, and a jack takes room he did not have on the ice. But he was not alone. He backed the ox up until the sledge stood just behind the heifer, and he made a bridle of soft rope from the pull chains up to the back of the yoke, so that the line ran from the calf's feet to the ox's great shoulders, and he knelt at the heifer's flank with one hand on the chains to guide and to save the calf from coming too fast, and he put his other hand on the ox's hip, and he said, in a voice as low and steady as he owned, "Get up." And Ledger took the weight. He did not lunge. A green animal lunges and tears a calf in two, but this was an old broke ox that some patient dead man had made, and he felt the line come tight, and he leaned into it slow, an inch and then an inch, his split hooves biting the ice, his swayed back rounding under the pull, 2,000 pounds of animal converting hay and heat and 30 years of gentleness into exactly the force a man's arms could not make. And Elias fed the chains through his fist and timed it to the heifer's straining and said, "Easy, easy, get up," and the calf came. It came in one long, slow slide. The head, the great shoulders that had hung it up, the barrel, and then all of it at once out onto the ice in a rush of steam, and Elias caught it and swung it down off the frozen ground onto the straw he had thrown on the sledge, and it was not breathing. He cleared its mouth with 2 fingers and rubbed it hard with a feed sack. Hard. Rubbing at it like a man who refuses to let a thing go of, and he put a piece of straw up its nostril to make it cough, and for a long 3 seconds there was nothing. There was only the wind and the steam and the ox standing quiet in the slack line, looking back with his one good eye. And then the calf shook its head and sneezed and drew a breath, a great shuddering wet breath, and bawled. And the heifer, hearing it, heaved herself up onto her feet on the ice and turned and began to lick her calf. And Elias sat back on his heels in the wind and put his cold face in his colder hands for one moment. Only one. And then he got up, because the calf was alive and the calf would freeze if he stopped. He loaded the calf onto the straw on the sledge and let the heifer follow her own bawling baby, and he drove the ox slow across the 300 yards of mirror ice to the barn, the sledge whispering behind, the mother slipping and catching and coming on, and he laid the calf in the deep straw of a box stall out of the wind and rubbed it down again and stripped the heifer's first milk into it with his own hands until it sucked, and it lived. That calf lived, and so did the one born the next night and the two born the night after that, because the ox brought each laboring heifer's calf in on the sledge out of the killing cold, 4 calves in 4 nights, $400 each come fall in a winter that would otherwise have been all loss. The power stayed out for 9 days. The line crews could not get up the valley for a week, the roads a solid glaze, the poles down by the dozen, and for 9 days the True Blood place ran on an animal and a wood pile and a well of patience. Water came up from the creek behind the ox, 400 gallons a day. Feed came down the lane behind the ox, a round bale twice a day, 1,200 pounds. Wood came across the yard behind the ox until the porch was stacked to the rail, better than a cord of it moved 50 feet at a time by a beast that asked for nothing but hay. Word of it moved even in a valley where nothing else could. A widow named Ferris, 2 farms over, sent her grandson across on foot to ask would Elias bring water for her 6 milk goats, and he did, a barrel of it on the sledge, and she stood in her doorway and watched the ox come up her buried lane and pressed her apron to her mouth and said she had not seen the like since she was a girl, and had thought the world had thrown all such animals away. The man who ran the feed store, Turlington, who had asked in front of the stove whether Elias wanted his order hitched to the ox, drove his truck into the ditch trying to reach his own cattle on the second day, and walked home and did not laugh at anybody after that. And on the 4th day, Cyrus Halloran's boy came walking up the frozen lane on foot, 4 miles from the flat ground, having fallen twice and torn his coat, to say that the Hallorans had lost their power same as everyone in their generator would not run, because nobody had ever put oil in it, and their new tractors' batteries had died flat in the cold, and they had cattle standing at frozen troughs with nothing to break the ice and no way to reach the far bales. And could Elias, folks said Elias had a way of moving in this, could Elias come? And Elias yoked the ox one more time and put the water tank on the sledge and went down the valley on the ice that no truck in the county could travel, and he broke the Halloran's troughs and hauled their water and skidded their bales down to their bawling cattle. And it was Cyrus himself who met him in the yard, Cyrus with a week's gray beard and a face gone humble in a way the valley had never seen, and Cyrus put his bare hand on the ox's frost-rimed shoulder and looked at the swayed back and the crooked horn and the clouded eye, and he said, quiet, so the boy would not hear him have to say it, I was wrong about this animal. I stood at your fence and I laughed at him, and he's the only thing that's moved in this whole valley for a week. That's not a lawn ornament. That's the smartest $25 any man ever spent. And Elias, who did not gloat and never had, only said, "He does what I ask." Then he broke the ice on one more trough and turned the ox for home. When the power came back on the 9th day, humming up out of nothing the way it had gone, the child ran through the house, turning on every light and laughing. And Marta stood at the window over the sink and watched her husband turn the ox loose in the yard in the last of the daylight. And she watched the animal walk over to the fence and stand in the exact place where the child liked to talk to him, waiting. And she dried her hands on her apron, and she said to no one, to the window, that he had never been worthless. Nobody had bid on him, so they were going to grind him up, and that had never once been the same thing as him not being worth anything. She had heard her own daughter say it in the yard the first night, and had not believed it, and now she did. And she would say so to anyone in the valley who still wanted to laugh. Ledger lived 9 more years on that place. He is buried up on the spruce ridge under a flat stone with no words on it, next to the good dog and the head of the first tractor in the ground he saved a family from losing. And every January, when the radio starts up about freezing rain and the valley goes quiet and glassy and the modern world holds its breath, waiting to see if the lights will stay on, the people down there tell their children the story of the crooked horn ox that nobody would buy, and they end it the way Elias ended it. Every time, at the kitchen table with the lamp lit. "A tractor," he would say, "is worth what it cost you the day it will not start. But a thing that keeps its own fire going, that eats what grows in your own field, that comes when you call it in the dark, that thing is worth more than money the day the money stops working." And then he would look at whichever child had asked, and ask them back, gently, the only question worth asking. When the day comes that the easy way fails, which will you have kept, the thing that was cheap to run when times were good, or the thing that will still get up in the cold and pull? Think on it. And down the valley the wind would move over the ice, and up on the ridge the flat stone would hold the snow. And in a warm kitchen a family that had been the joke of the county would sit close together in the lamplight and be, quietly, the richest people for 40 miles in any direction.